It began without warning, no ceremony, no announcement, just a sudden silent summons that pulled every senior royal back to the palace under the cover of urgency. Staff were dismissed early, corridors fell silent, phones stopped ringing. And behind the ancient doors of power, King Charles called an emergency meeting that would fracture loyalties, shatter expectations, and unleash devastating family news no one was prepared to hear. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The summons itself carried a tone that no royal could ignore, not because of its wording, but because of its absence of explanation. There was no context, no preparation, only a command that demanded presence, and that alone was enough to ignite a quiet but unmistakable sense of dread. Within hours, the palace transformed into something unrecognizable, not in appearance, but in feeling. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Trusted aides spoke in fragments, their voices lower than usual, their expressions tighter. Security protocols tightened in ways that had not been seen in years, not even during moments of national uncertainty. Something was unfolding, and everyone inside those walls could feel it pressing down like invisible weight. Those closest to the king noticed the change first, not in his words, but in his silence. He had become more distant in recent weeks, more reflective, as if every public appearance required a deeper effort to maintain composure. His usual rhythm had faltered. His smile, once measured and diplomatic, now seemed burdened by something heavier, something unresolved. Those who knew him best recognized the signs of internal conflict, the kind that emerges only when a decision has already been made but not yet spoken aloud. And yet, he said nothing. He carried it alone. One by one, the senior members of the royal family arrived, each drawn into the same tightening circle of uncertainty. Their arrivals were quieter than usual. No casual greetings, no lingering conversations, just brief acknowledgments, controlled expressions, and a shared understanding that whatever awaited them would not be routine. They entered separately, deliberately avoiding prolonged eye contact, as if acknowledging each other's fear would make the unknown more real. The corridors, once symbols of continuity and tradition, now felt like passageways leading toward something irreversible. Palace aides, trained to remain emotionally neutral, could not hide their unease. They had seen moments of tension before, moments of crisis and confrontation. But this felt different. This felt heavier. Some whispered that the king had postponed this meeting several times already, wrestling privately with the timing, perhaps even with the truth itself. That hesitation alone revealed the magnitude of what he was about to reveal. This was not administrative. This was not ceremonial. This was personal. And deeply so. The emotional gravity surrounding the meeting was impossible to ignore. It lingered in every movement, every silence, every measured breath. The weight of legacy, the crown, the institution, the bloodline hung over them all like an invisible force demanding resolution. Because whatever King Charles was about to say would not simply pass as another difficult moment. It would mark a division between what had been and what would follow. It would alter perception. It would challenge loyalties. And those present could already sense it, even before a single word had been spoken. There are moments in history when time does not simply move forward, it fractures, leaving behind a clear line between before and after. This was one of those moments. No one spoke of it openly, but they all felt it. The anticipation was not loud, but it was suffocating, because deep down, every person walking into that room understood something instinctively. The truth waiting inside was not meant to comfort. It was meant to confront. It was meant to dismantle certainty and replace it with something far more painful. And as they took their places, surrounded by silence and expectation, one realization became impossible to escape. But as the doors closed and silence filled the room, the most devastating truth wasn't the meeting itself, it was the burden King Charles had been carrying alone long before anyone else knew. For weeks, perhaps longer, King Charles had been living with a truth that weighed heavier than the crown itself. He smiled in public. He fulfilled his duties. But behind closed doors, his silence spoke louder than any declaration. Because what he knew wasn't just painful, it was destabilizing. And when the moment finally came to reveal it, the revelation would threaten bonds forged over decades and redefine the meaning of loyalty within the royal family. The burden did not arrive suddenly. It had crept into his life slowly, quietly, embedding itself in his thoughts until it became impossible to escape. At first, he believed he could manage it, contain it, delay it long enough to preserve what little emotional stability remained within the family. But truth has a way of demanding recognition, and the longer he carried it, the heavier it became. Every conversation began to feel like a performance. Every smile, a carefully constructed shield. Those closest to him noticed it immediately, even if they never spoke it aloud. His advisors, who had stood beside him through decades of public scrutiny, saw the subtle shift. He paused longer before answering simple questions. He seemed distracted in moments that once required effortless composure. There were times when his attention drifted entirely, as if his mind had wandered somewhere far beyond the walls of the palace. He was no longer simply governing, he was wrestling with something far more personal. Something far more dangerous. And yet, he said nothing. Not because he didn't trust them, but because speaking it aloud would make it real. It would trigger consequences he could no longer control. In private moments, he turned to history not as comfort, but as guidance. Ancient documents, letters from monarchs long gone, decisions made in moments of crisis. He studied them carefully, searching not for answers, but for strength. Because he knew this was not just about his reign, this was about continuity, legacy, survival. The monarchy had endured for centuries because difficult truths had been faced, not avoided. And now, he stood at the same crossroads. But knowing what had to be done did not make it easier. If anything, it made it harder. Because this truth did not exist in isolation. It touched people he loved, people he had protected, people who trusted him. The emotional cost of revealing it would not fall on him alone. It would ripple outward, fracturing relationships, reshaping loyalties, and forcing each member of the family to confront a reality they had never anticipated. That was the part he feared most, not the judgment of the public, but the pain in the eyes of those closest to him. The quiet realization that his words would forever alter how they saw him, how they saw each other, and perhaps even how they saw themselves. He questioned himself repeatedly. Was it necessary? Was there another way? Could silence preserve what truth would destroy? But deep down, he already knew the answer. Silence was not protection. Silence was delay. And delay only made the eventual impact more devastating. The institution he had sworn to protect could not survive on avoidance. It required clarity, even when clarity brought pain. It required courage, even when courage demanded sacrifice. This was no longer about personal comfort. This was about responsibility. And responsibility does not wait for readiness. It demands action when action feels most impossible. The emotional toll became visible in ways he could no longer conceal. He carried himself differently now, not with weakness, but with the weight of inevitability. He had reached the point where the truth no longer belonged solely to him. It had grown too large, too significant, too dangerous to remain hidden. And in the quiet moments before the meeting, he understood something with absolute certainty. Once spoken, there would be no repair, no reversal, no return to the fragile peace that had existed before. The relationships he valued most would be tested in ways none of them could fully prepare for. Trust would be questioned, loyalties would shift, and the emotional consequences would unfold long after the words themselves had faded into silence. And when the moment finally arrived, Charles knew there was no turning back, because the words he was about to speak would change everything forever. The room was silent. No one moved. No one breathed. Then, King Charles finally spoke, and in that moment, time itself seemed to fracture. His voice carried the weight of finality, and with each word, the emotional foundation of the royal family began to crack. Some stared in disbelief, others looked away entirely. Because what Charles revealed wasn't just devastating, it was a declaration that would reshape destinies, loyalties, and the very future of the crown. He did not rush, he did not soften the edges. Every word was delivered with deliberate precision, stripped of comfort, stripped of illusion. This was not a moment for interpretation. This was a moment for truth, and truth, once spoken, cannot be contained. It spreads, it settles, it forces itself into every unspoken space between people who once believed they understood each other completely. His voice, steady yet heavy, carried something deeper than authority. It carried acceptance. Not acceptance of peace, but acceptance of consequence. He had already lived with the reality of these words long before anyone else in that room, and now he was passing that burden forward. The silence that followed was not empty. It was suffocating. It pressed against every person present, demanding emotional response while simultaneously denying them the ability to produce one. Some could not move, others could not even look at him. Because in that moment, the king was no longer simply a father or a brother or a relative. He was the voice of irreversible change, the voice of something none of them could escape. The announcement did not simply disrupt expectation, it dismantled it. Long-held assumptions, emotional certainties, and quiet beliefs that had existed for years were suddenly exposed as fragile. Some had built their understanding of the future on foundations they believed were unshakable. And now, those foundations were gone. Not gradually, instantly, replaced by something unfamiliar, something terrifying. The emotional reactions, though restrained, were undeniable. One could sense disbelief lingering beneath controlled expressions, as if the mind itself refused to accept what the ears had already heard. Others experienced something deeper, something closer to betrayal. Not because of what had been said, but because of what had been hidden until now. Trust, once unquestioned, now stood vulnerable under the weight of revelation. And yet, there were those who remained still, not out of acceptance, but out of understanding. They recognized the inevitability of this moment. They saw the emotional cost written into every word Charles had spoken. Because this was not a decision born from indifference. This was a decision born from necessity. That was what made it so devastating. He had not spoken to hurt them. He had spoken because silence was no longer an option. And in doing so, he had sacrificed something deeply personal, his role not as monarch, but as protector of emotional stability. His responsibility to the institution had demanded something from him that no father, no brother, no man ever truly wants to give. The aftermath of his words lingered heavily. He did not repeat himself. He did not attempt to comfort them with reassurance he knew he could not honestly offer. Because there are moments when reassurance becomes meaningless. Moments when truth demands to stand alone, without protection, without apology. And in that moment, he understood something with painful clarity. He had not simply delivered devastating news. He had altered the emotional landscape of his family forever. He had changed how they would see him, how they would see each other, and perhaps most painfully, how they would see the future itself. The emotional exhaustion on him was undeniable, not expressed through weakness, but through stillness. He had carried the truth alone for so long, and now that it had finally been spoken, the weight had shifted, but it had not disappeared. It had simply spread, embedding itself into every heart present. And though the room remained quiet, the consequences were already unfolding, quietly, invisibly, inevitably. Because devastating truths do not end in the moment they are spoken. They begin there, they grow there, they reshape everything from that point forward. And as each member of the royal family struggled to confront what they had just heard, one reality became impossible to avoid. But the true devastation wasn't just the words themselves, it was how each member of the royal family would respond to the truth they never expected to hear. The silence didn't last. Because once the shock settled in, emotion took its place. Shock became anger, confusion became confrontation, and loyalty was suddenly questioned in ways no one had anticipated. This wasn't just an announcement, it was a rupture. One that exposed hidden tensions, old wounds, and unspoken fears. And in that moment, it became clear the royal family wasn't just facing devastating news, they were facing each other. The emotional restraint that had defined the monarchy for generations began to crack under pressure that could no longer be contained. The truth had done more than disrupt expectations, it had forced everyone present to confront realities they had spent years avoiding. For some, the pain surfaced immediately, not through dramatic outbursts, but through subtle shifts in expression, through stillness that spoke louder than any words. Because when trust is shaken at its core, the first reaction is not always noise. Sometimes, it is silence filled with questions too dangerous to ask aloud. Others struggled to mask the emotional wound that had just been inflicted. Their disbelief was not rooted in denial, but in the sudden collapse of certainty. They had believed in stability, in continuity, in an unspoken understanding of how the future would unfold. And now, that future had been rewritten without their consent. That realization cut deeper than the announcement itself. It introduced a painful uncertainty that none of them could immediately resolve. Some turned inward, retreating into thought, attempting to reconstruct meaning from fragments of a reality that no longer aligned with what they had always believed. But beneath the surface, something more volatile was forming. Because devastating news does not exist in isolation, it awakens memory. It revives moments once dismissed, conversations once overlooked, decisions once accepted without question. And suddenly, those moments took on new meaning. Old wounds, carefully buried beneath years of diplomacy and public unity, began to resurface. Unspoken resentments, long suppressed for the sake of stability, now stood dangerously close to the surface. The announcement had not created those fractures, it had revealed them. Trust, once assumed to be permanent, now stood fragile and exposed. Some questioned not just the truth itself, but the timing. Why now? Why this moment? Why this way? These questions lingered, unspoken but undeniable, hanging heavily between family members who suddenly found themselves separated not by distance but by perception. Because the truth, once revealed, does not unite everyone equally. It divides understanding. It forces individuals to interpret the same moment in profoundly different ways. For some, Charles's words represented necessity. For others, they represented betrayal. And in that divide, something irreversible began to form. Not open rebellion, but something quieter, something far more dangerous: emotional distance. There were those who remained outwardly composed, but their silence carried weight. It was not agreement. It was not acceptance. It was calculation. They understood the magnitude of what had occurred, and they knew that immediate reaction would serve no purpose. Because this moment was not just emotional, it was strategic. The truth had altered the balance of understanding within the family. And with that shift came consequences none of them could fully predict yet. Relationships that had once felt unshakable now existed under strain. Familiar bonds felt unfamiliar. Certainty had been replaced by fragile tension, and the emotional safety they had relied upon was gone. Charles, though still their king, had become something else in that moment, a symbol not just of leadership, but of transformation. And transformation, even when necessary, carries pain. The aftermath was not defined by resolution, but by uncertainty. No one knew yet how deeply this truth would reshape their relationships. No one knew who would accept it, who would resist it, or who would quietly redefine their place within the family as a result. But one thing was already becoming clear. The announcement had not ended anything. It had begun something far more unpredictable. Because devastating truths do not simply alter the present, they reshape the future in ways no one can fully control. And as emotions erupted behind palace walls, an even greater question began to emerge: why now? Why now? Why this moment? Why this meeting? Those questions echoed louder than the announcement itself. Because timing is never accidental in the royal family. Every move is calculated, every word measured, and the moment King Charles chose to reveal this devastating truth suggested something far deeper was unfolding, something strategic, something inevitable, and something that could no longer be delayed without risking even greater consequences. The truth itself was painful, but the timing made it suspicious. Because those closest to him understood one unshakable principle of royal survival: nothing of this magnitude happens without reason. Nothing is revealed without pressure. And pressure in this world does not come from emotion alone. It comes from forces that operate quietly, persistently, and often invisibly. For weeks, subtle signs had pointed toward an approaching breaking point. Advisors had grown more cautious in their tone, more deliberate in their counsel. They understood the fragile balance between silence and disclosure, and they knew that balance was beginning to collapse. There were whispers of deadlines, not formal ones, but psychological ones. The kind that emerge when withholding truth becomes more dangerous than revealing it. Because silence, once protective, can eventually become corrosive. It can weaken confidence. It can undermine trust. And in an institution built entirely on perception, trust is everything. Charles himself had likely wrestled with this reality long before the meeting was ever called. He had lived long enough within the machinery of monarchy to understand the risks of delay. The longer a truth remains hidden, the more power it gains. It begins to shape behavior, influence decisions, and distort relationships in ways that cannot be undone. By the time it surfaces, its impact is far greater than it would have been if spoken sooner. And perhaps that was the realization that finally forced his hand. Not fear of the truth itself, but fear of what continued silence might destroy. There were also deeper concerns tied not to emotion, but to survival. The monarchy does not operate solely on tradition. It operates on continuity, stability, predictability. Any threat to those foundations must be addressed before it grows beyond control. And the devastating truth Charles revealed may have represented such a threat. Not immediate collapse, but gradual erosion. The kind that weakens institutions from within until they can no longer sustain themselves. His decision then was not just personal, it was structural. He was not simply protecting himself. He was protecting something far larger. Yet that explanation, while logical, did not erase the emotional consequences. Family members could not ignore the possibility that the timing held deeper meaning. Some wondered whether Charles had known this truth for longer than he admitted. Others questioned whether external influences had shaped his decision. Not coercion, but persuasion. The quiet pressure of advisors who understood that preserving the monarchy sometimes requires painful sacrifice. And that sacrifice often begins within the family itself. To some, the announcement felt less like a choice and more like an inevitability that had been building beneath the surface for years. Something that had reached a point where concealment was no longer sustainable. And in that realization came a more unsettling understanding this moment was not the end of a crisis. It was the beginning of a transformation. Because when truth enters a system built on continuity, it does not simply settle. It restructures. It forces adaptation. It redraws emotional boundaries. It compels individuals to redefine their roles, their loyalties, and their expectations of the future. Charles may have delivered the truth in a single moment, but its consequences would unfold slowly, unpredictably, and permanently. Every relationship, every alliance, every quiet understanding that had once defined the family now existed under new conditions. Nothing outward had changed yet, but everything beneath the surface had shifted. And as the reality settled in, one truth became unavoidable: the royal family would never be the same again. Behind closed doors, the emotional consequences became impossible to contain. Some withdrew completely. Others demanded answers. And for King Charles, the weight of his decision became painfully visible. Because devastating family news doesn't end when it's spoken, it begins. And what followed wasn't just emotional, it was transformational. Bonds were tested, loyalties redefined, and the emotional cost became undeniable for everyone involved. The meeting may have ended in silence, but its impact had only just begun to unfold. Each person carried the truth away with them, not as shared understanding, but as private burden. The corridors that had once connected them now seemed to separate them, emotionally if not physically. Conversations became shorter, eye contact became rarer. The emotional closeness they had relied upon for strength now felt fragile, uncertain, and painfully exposed. For some, the immediate response was retreat. Not out of indifference, but out of survival. Because confronting such a profound shift required distance. It required space to process a reality that had arrived without warning and without preparation. The truth Charles had delivered had not simply altered their understanding of the future, it had destabilized their emotional present. And in that instability, individuals reacted differently. Some sought solitude, turning inward, replaying his words repeatedly in their minds as if repetition might soften their meaning. Others struggled with questions they could not yet voice, questions that lingered heavily in the spaces between loyalty and disbelief. The most painful realization was not what had been said, but what it implied. Because if something so fundamental could change so suddenly, then what else had they misunderstood? What else had remained unspoken? Charles himself did not emerge untouched. Though he had prepared for this moment intellectually, its emotional toll proved far greater than he could have anticipated. There is a difference between knowing a truth and witnessing its effect on those you love. He had carried the burden alone, believing that isolation would protect them. But now, that burden had multiplied. It no longer lived solely within him, it lived within them all. And that realization carried its own kind of sorrow. He had done what he believed was necessary, but necessity does not erase pain. It does not restore what has been fractured, it only explains why the fracture occurred. His silence in the aftermath spoke volumes, not defensive, not regretful, but heavy with acceptance. He understood that leadership sometimes demands emotional sacrifice, and he had made his. But sacrifice, once made, cannot be reversed. As the hours passed, confrontation gave way to something quieter, something deeper. Silence became the dominant language. Not peaceful silence, but reflective silence, the kind that signals internal struggle rather than resolution. Family members no longer challenged him openly, but their distance revealed everything words could not express. Trust had not vanished entirely, but it had changed shape. It now existed alongside uncertainty, no longer unconditional, no longer immune to doubt. Emotional bonds that had once felt permanent now required reevaluation. Some relationships grew colder, not through hostility, but through hesitation. Others remained outwardly intact, yet carried new emotional complexity beneath the surface. This was not a collapse. It was a transformation. And transformation, by its nature, is uncomfortable. It forces adaptation. It forces individuals to confront who they are in light of what they now know. The family dynamic, once defined by predictable roles and quiet understanding, now existed in a fragile state of recalibration. Everyone was still present. Nothing visible had been lost. But something intangible had shifted. Something essential. And though the truth remained contained within palace walls for now, its emotional consequences could not remain hidden forever. Because private devastation has a way of revealing itself, slowly, subtly, through absence, through hesitation, through the quiet signals that something fundamental has changed. And in that fragile silence, one realization became impossible to ignore. Because while the family struggled privately, the outside world was beginning to notice something was terribly wrong. The palace said nothing, no statement, no denial, no reassurance. And that silence became louder than any announcement. Observers noticed subtle changes, altered schedules, canceled appearances, and strained public interactions. Something had happened, something significant. And the longer the palace remained silent, the clearer it became. The devastating family news King Charles delivered wasn't just private, it was reshaping the monarchy itself. At first, the changes were easy to dismiss. Minor adjustments, routine absences, the kind that rarely attract attention beyond palace walls. But slowly, patterns began to emerge. Appearances once considered essential were quietly postponed. Engagements that symbolized unity were suddenly reassigned or removed altogether. It wasn't the cancellations themselves that raised concern, it was their consistency. Because in an institution built on reliability, inconsistency speaks volumes. The public, though often distant from the monarchy's inner workings, has always possessed a unique sensitivity to emotional undercurrents. They noticed the hesitation. They sensed the restraint. They observed interactions that lacked their usual warmth, replaced instead by something more measured, more cautious. It was not dramatic. It was subtle. But subtlety, in this context, carried meaning. The monarchy has always relied on controlled perception. Stability must be visible, even when uncertainty exists behind closed doors. And now, that stability seemed to flicker. The palace's refusal to clarify only deepened the mystery. Because silence, when chosen deliberately, becomes a form of communication. It signals gravity. It signals complexity. It signals that whatever truth exists behind the scenes is too significant to be reduced to simple explanation. Advisors, trained to protect institutional integrity, understood that any acknowledgement could ignite further questions. And questions once ignited are impossible to contain. So they chose restraint, they chose absence, they chose silence. But silence does not erase suspicion. It amplifies it. Those who observed closely began to detect shifts not just in behavior, but in presence. Certain figures who once stood confidently beside Charles now appeared more distant, their interactions more formal, their emotional connection less visible. This was not hostility. It was recalibration. Because devastating truths do not merely wound, they reorganize emotional hierarchy. They alter how individuals see themselves in relation to power, to legacy, and to each other. Public perception, once grounded in continuity, now felt uncertain. Not unstable, but unsettled. The monarchy had always projected inevitability, a sense that its structure existed beyond disruption. And yet, something about this moment suggested transition. Not collapse, but evolution. The kind that occurs quietly, without formal declaration, but with consequences that unfold over time. Those who paid attention could feel it. A shift in tone, a shift in emotional alignment, a shift in the unspoken balance that defines every royal relationship. The absence of explanation created space for interpretation, and interpretation created unease. Because when clarity disappears, imagination takes its place. And imagination, when combined with truth withheld, becomes powerful. The monarchy itself had not spoken of change, but change was already visible in its rhythm, in its presence, in its emotional atmosphere. This was not a temporary disturbance. It was something deeper, something structural, something that would not resolve quickly. Because devastating revelations do not fade with time, they reshape time. They redefine expectations, they alter futures. What Charles had revealed within those walls was no longer confined there. Its influence had begun to extend outward, touching perception, influencing behavior, and preparing the institution for something new. Something uncertain, something irreversible. Because the devastating truth Charles revealed wasn't just about the present, it was about the future of the crown itself. This wasn't just a moment. It was a dividing line between what the royal family had been and what it would become. King Charles had spoken. The truth was out, and nothing could undo it. The devastating family news delivered behind palace doors would ripple forward, shaping destinies, altering relationships, and redefining the monarchy itself. Because sometimes, the greatest threat to a crown isn't outside forces, it's the truth spoken within. In the days that followed, nothing appeared dramatically different on the surface. The monarchy continued. Duties were fulfilled. Words were spoken carefully, appearances maintained with the same precision that had defined royal survival for centuries. But beneath that continuity, something profound had shifted. The emotional certainty that once anchored the family had been replaced by something far more fragile: awareness. Awareness that even the most enduring institutions are not immune to internal reckoning. Awareness that power, legacy, and loyalty exist in constant negotiation, even among those bound by blood. King Charles himself had crossed an invisible threshold. His announcement did not weaken his authority, it redefined it. He was no longer simply the monarch who inherited responsibility. He had become the monarch who confronted it. That distinction would follow him for the rest of his reign. Because leadership is not defined by moments of comfort, but by moments of confrontation. And in choosing truth over silence, he had altered how history would remember him. Not as the king who preserved emotional peace, but as the king who risked emotional fracture to preserve something he believed was greater than himself. Yet the emotional cost of that decision could not be measured in ceremony or public approval. It lived quietly within the family itself. in the spaces between conversations, in the pauses where trust once existed effortlessly. Emotional scars rarely announce themselves openly. They exist in subtle hesitation, in recalculated loyalty, in the quiet understanding that something essential has changed. Relationships endured, but they endured differently. They adapted, they evolved, and in doing so, they carried forward the memory of the moment that forced them to transform. The balance of emotional influence within the family had shifted permanently, not through conflict, but through revelation. Because truth rearranges perception. It forces individuals to reconsider their place, their role, their future. Some accepted the new reality quickly, recognizing the inevitability of change. Others required time, retreating inward to reconcile personal loyalty with institutional permanence. But regardless of individual reaction, the outcome was the same. The monarchy had entered a new chapter, one defined not by inherited stability, but by earned resilience. Trust had not vanished, but it had matured. It now existed alongside awareness, shaped by the understanding that even the strongest bonds must sometimes endure strain to survive. Identity itself had been reshaped, not destroyed, but refined. Because institutions that endure are not those that avoid truth, but those that survive it. The monarchy, long seen as immovable, had revealed its humanity, and in doing so, it had revealed its strength. What Charles delivered was not simply devastating family news. It was a moment of reckoning that forced everyone within the palace and beyond it to confront the reality that legacy is not preserved through silence. It is preserved through courage. The consequences of that moment would not fade with time. They would echo quietly through future decisions, future relationships, future generations. Long after the words themselves were forgotten, their impact would remain, woven into the emotional fabric of the crown itself. Because history is not shaped solely by victories. It is shaped by the moments when truth emerges, demanding to be acknowledged regardless of the cost. And in that acknowledgement, the monarchy did not end. It evolved. It endured. It carried forward, forever changed by the moment its king chose to speak what could no longer remain hidden. Because in the end, the most devastating battles for the crown are never fought in public, but in the quiet moments when truth finally breaks its silence. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.